talking about one of my passions, and that is magnesium and how it is truly the missing link to our optimizing our health. And my goal today is to help you enhance your overall understanding of this mineral and its wide range of actions. So we'll get started. We have a lot to cover. Let me just see here now. Okay, it's not moving. Oh, there we go. So just a little about me. Laura did speak a lot about this. So I am a licensed naturopathic doctor in Toronto, Ontario. My passion is obviously magnesium research, and there is tons of it. So we'll be going through some of that today. I do have a clinical focus in women's health, stress management, inflammatory conditions, and you'll see why I use magnesium a lot in my clinical practice. And I do love all things nature and hugging trees, and that is my stress reduction. So it's one of my favorite things to do. So what we're going to do or cover today are what is magnesium? So understanding its role in our health and well-being. We're going to talk about magnesium deficiency and why we're so deficient in this mineral. We're going to talk about the different forms of magnesium, the top food sources, and we're going to finish off with the top health benefits of magnesium. So before we get started, we kind of need to know what magnesium is. And overall, I can summarize and just say that it's a powerful mineral that's going to play a critical role in our health and well-being. And despite its behind the roll scenes in our health, it's a mineral that we really can't overlook if we want to optimize our health. So it is an essential mineral, meaning that it needs to come into the body via food or some form of supplementation or some form of transdermal application. It's the fourth most abundant mineral in the human body, and it's involved in 700 to 800 metabolic enzymatic reactions in the body. And that's the latest research. And what that means is that it has its hands in a lot of different things when it comes to different processes in the body. And we're going to touch on some of those today, the most common ones. And every cell in the body contains magnesium and needs it to function. And there's hardly an organ or a system in the body that does not rely on magnesium to function optimally. And that's really important to know when we're talking about different things that magnesium starts to get fed in when we're doing health conditions. So the role of magnesium is really in making our body run effectively and smoothly. And those roles can include all kinds of processes, including protein synthesis, nerve and muscle functions, blood sugar control, inflammation, stress reduction, sleep, blood pressure regulation, the list goes on. These are probably the biggest areas where we see magnesium playing a really big role. But it's also why we see magnesium implicated in many different symptoms and dozens of health conditions. So we have to start with magnesium deficiency. And the reason we have to start here is that magnesium deficiency in the general population is really high. It's estimated about 70 to 80% of us are deficient. And unfortunately, most of us are totally unaware of this. And so it's important to realize the different causes of magnesium deficiency so that we're not supplementing without any health gain. So, we don't want to be supplementing if we're just expelling magnesium quickly on the other side. It's not really causing us to make any gains when it comes to our health. And so knowing why we're deficient in magnesium, and there's quite a few reasons, we're going to go through them next, is really, really important. But before we get there, I want to quote this quote from the Journal of Intensive Care Medicine. It was in a study, and it basically said that a deficiency in this critical mineral makes you twice as likely to die as other people. And with magnesium being responsible for so many biochemical processes and reactions in the body, it's also been claimed that magnesium deficiency is the single largest health problem in our world today. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. So when we look at magnesium deficiency signs and symptoms, there are a ton. I have put the most common ones that we see here. They can range from headaches, concentration issues, migraines, nervousness, all kinds of muscle aches, joint pain, tightness, tingling of hands. We have sleep and stress issues. We have anxiety, depression. We have cognitive disturbances. We see lots of gastrointestinal disturbances, lots of heart-related issues, can be blood pressure, can be cardiac arrhythmias. We see blood sugar dysregulation, insulin resistance, and low vitamin D status. So I want you to remember these symptoms because they do actually play a big role when we actually want to see if somebody is deficient or not, because the testing, unfortunately, is not great with this mineral, and we'll go into that in a little bit. But first, I want to touch on why are we so deficient? So here are all the reasons or things that are going to deplete magnesium. And so we have to start with our food. And we know that the nutrients in our soil are not what they were 5, even 10 years ago. There's been a serious depletion of nutrients, not just magnesium, but all nutrients in our soil due to modern farming practices, due to commercial farming practices that often don't return many of these nutrients, including magnesium, into the soil. So our foods aren't as rich in magnesium as they used to be. So we're not getting in as much as we were. We also see deficiency from poor diet and food processing. So when we process foods or have refined foods, we lose magnesium out of that process. And so we know that processed foods offer us no nutritional value, and of course, they're usually going to be devoid of magnesium and other nutrients for that matter. But we also see that sugar is a major robber of magnesium, and it's been shown in some studies, there's some, it's somewhere between 40 and 54 molecules of magnesium is required to process 1 molecule of sugar. So if you have a patient who is eating lots of sugar, lots of processed foods, lots of, they're going to be going through their magnesium stores quite quickly because it takes a lot of magnesium to process just a small molecule of sugar. So that's a big one as well. We also see less magnesium in our water. The filtering of the water process takes out the magnesium, and so we are left with less magnesium in our water. Stress. This is a huge thing in our society today, and being stressed out depletes our magnesium by activating our sympathetic nervous system. And this is going to make us burn through that magnesium at a higher rate. We also know that when we activate the sympathetic nervous system, we have less stomach acid. And when we have less stomach acid, we're not going to absorb. And so we see magnesium actually not being absorbed when we're under chronic stress. And it's kind of a vicious cycle because being stressed depletes magnesium, but low magnesium increases your stress response. So it's, it's like a tug of war there. So it's really important that we deal with our patient's stress, give them the tools that are necessary to deal with that stress properly. Then we see poor absorption. So we know that magnesium is absorbed in the small intestine. And so patients that have celiac or inflammation in the digestive tract or IBS, inflammatory bowel diseases, they're going to have trouble absorbing this mineral because they're not going to have the absorption capacity as someone who doesn't have one of these conditions. So we see that most times these individuals are also deficient. And then, of course, we see medications. And if you just look at these medications, these are the most popular medications that are prescribed to patients from their family physicians. These are proton pump inhibitors, diuretics, antibiotics, birth control, insulin, statins, corticosteroids. There are a few others, but these are like your big class drugs that are prescribed to patients. And the reason that medications deplete magnesium is that they use the same metabolism and transport pathways in the body for their absorption, their metabolism, and their elimination. And unfortunately, the drug wins. And so magnesium ends up being depleted. And then we also see fluoridated water. So a lot of our water systems now contain fluoride, or even when we're buying bottled water, we do see fluoride in some bottled waters. Fluoride binds to magnesium and then reduces the absorption. And so if you were constantly having fluoridated water, we're seeing that we're not getting as much magnesium as we could from that water. And then we see the excess loss from urine, and this can include alcohol, this can include diarrhea, sweating. We have to remember magnesium is a electrolyte, so we are going to lose some of that, you know, even exercising. I mean, if we're doing a hardcore workout and we're sweating, we're losing electrolytes, we're losing magnesium. Then we see the anti-nutrients, the tannins, the phytic acid, the oxalic acid. So there are patients who can't eat oxalic food, high foods like a spinach or something. Those patients will tend to not be able to absorb magnesium because the food, those nutrients actually bind to magnesium and prevent the absorption of it. And then we also see our seniors. We know that intestinal absorption actually decreases with age, and so they're going to absorb less. And we almost always know that most seniors are also on at least one prescribed medication, and one of those prescribed medications are one of those medications I listed. So they've kind of got this double whammy happening, and they're really the most the one population that really suffers the most from magnesium deficiency, and they have the magnesium deficiency most often as well. And then finally, we see the vitamin D supplementation. So, you know, we have to look at taking large doses of vitamin D can intensify an already magnesium deficient state. And this is because vitamin D and magnesium go together. So they need each other in order to work. We need magnesium in order to activate vitamin D. And if we over supplement vitamin D and we don't have enough magnesium in the system, then we can intensify that deficiency even more. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the health conditions. All right, so I have to put up this warning because that widespread commonality of magnesium deficiency really cannot be overlooked if we want to optimize our health. And you can see that despite having a healthy diet and, you know, having foods, a well-balanced diet and having all your foods coming in, you can still have a deficiency in this mineral over time because of some of those other lifestyle factors that I just mentioned in those slides. So we really need to pay attention to this, and we really need to do our due diligence and go through those steps and see what actually is, does that patient have? Are they on those medications? Are they working out excessively every day? Do they eat processed foods and those kinds of things? All right, so testing magnesium. This is tricky, and this is why I wanted you to keep those symptoms and signs fresh in your mind. It's difficult to test magnesium, and it's difficult because over 50%, 50 to 60% of magnesium is stored in the skeletal system, so in the bones, and the rest is found in muscle, soft tissues, and bodily fluids. Now, if we're testing serum magnesium in the blood, that's not going to give us a very accurate measure because it's only going to measure 1 to 2% because that's all that's stored in the blood. So when they test the magnesium serum on your blood work, they're only looking at that 1 to 2%. So most times that number is going to be somewhere in the low to mid range, but it's still not an accurate figure because we're not really seeing what's out there outside of that 1 to 2%. We can look at red blood cell magnesium, which is also a blood test. It's better, but it still lacks a full picture. So here, that's the one I use in practice. I only use RBC magnesium because at least it gives us a little bit more than just the serum magnesium. But here, wherever the lab is giving you the range, it's going to be different depending upon what lab you use. You definitely want to be at the higher end range because being at the low to mid range is still going to cause deficiency symptoms. And then there's also hair mineral analysis that can be an option, but evidence is lacking there. So we can't really gauge and get a good indication of magnesium status. Oftentimes, what I do is I will run the red blood cell magnesium, but then I also take the presentation of the patient. So the symptoms, the signs, and I look at what can deplete magnesium in their lifestyle or in what they're taking as far as medications and how they eat. And then I look at all their symptoms and then I kind of dose it. And if I dose magnesium and the symptom improves, then I have to be thinking that there is some type of deficiency that's happening. So we can test, but it's not the best option, doesn't always give us the best picture. And I would also do a great history intake, see where they're lacking, see what their symptoms are, give the supplement, and then see what the improvement is. So here's just basically another thing that I want you to remember is that a chronic deficiency of magnesium can actually occur without actual lab values being out of range. And that is because it's so hard to test magnesium for any accurate type of measure. So even though their lab values are in range, if they have the symptoms or they have the signs, we have to investigate those and take a good history because that deficiency can have a negative impact on that individual's health and well-being. So now we're going to get into the forms of magnesium, and this is a popular question that I get all the time, and we could actually do a full hour on all the forms of magnesium, but we're not going to. So because there's lots of magnesium forms, and they all come with their own strengths and weaknesses. So what we're going to do is cover the most common ones today that have the most research and that I often use in practice and that are readily available. The other thing is with a lot of these forms of magnesium, they're not readily available to the general public. So we're going to touch on those today. Now we're going to start with a couple that I just want to say some things about so that we don't buy the wrong form of magnesium. So the first, magnesium hydroxide, we find this in antacids or over-the-counter laxatives, has very poor bioavailability, and it's considered to be one of the most least optimal forms to use as a supplement. So I highly recommend do not choose this as the choice of magnesium. I have had patients that have come in and had antacids thinking they are getting magnesium. So we're not absorbing this. This is not a form that I would recommend. Magnesium oxide, it also is a poor source of magnesium when it's on its own. So they sell magnesium oxide on its own, and it is a laxative. It's a very strong one. It's inexpensive, and that's why they use it so widely. You will often find these in pharmacies, and it's insoluble in water, so that makes its bioavailability less than 5%. So we see side effects that include, of course, frequent digestive upset, diarrhea, loose stools, nausea. So on its own, I would avoid this supplement. Now, We do see magnesium oxide in formula. So we see forms of magnesium, maybe 4 or 5 different forms of magnesium that are in formulas. And they will put magnesium oxide in that formula to buffer. And that is okay because it actually allows for more magnesium to be put into the formula, because the oxide molecule is actually smaller than a lot of the amino acid molecules. So they are going to be able to put more magnesium into that. Now, if you have a suspicion that maybe there is more oxide than any of the other forms in the formula, then it's always important to contact the manufacturer and or the distributor and find out how much is actually in those formulas, because we definitely do not want 95% of the magnesium being oxide and the rest being, all the other forms. So that is something just to keep in mind. But you will see it in formulas, and you will also see it in the buffered bisglycinate. They put it in there because, again, they're buffering it and they're able to get more magnesium into the capsule. All right, magnesium citrate. So this was the popular form of magnesium before bisglycinate or glycinate came onto the scene. And it's a commonly used form of magnesium. It has good bioavailability, especially compared to oxide on its own. We use it to support digestion, specifically constipation, acid reflux, and migraines. Now, because citrate is not actively absorbed like an amino acid, and this is why when we get into the amino acid magnesiums, they don't often cause loose stool, because the amino acid actually helps to not cause the water to get into the small intestine. So citrate actually brings water into the small intestine, and then of course that's going to cause loose stools or digestive upset at higher doses. So what I like to do with magnesium citrate, I use this a lot with my migraine and acid reflux patients, as well as constipation. But for instance, in the research, it shows for migraines, we need to be looking at about 600 milligrams of citrate to effectively prevent migraines. Now, if the patient is coming in and you give them 600 milligrams of citrate and they're not used to it, they're going to probably end up with very loose stools, if not diarrhea. So we have to start small and titrate them up when we're looking at citrate. So I usually start in 150 or 200 milligrams and then titrate up to the 600 milligrams or whatever the amount is that I'm trying to do. And we do it slowly, and it's usually not an issue after that. So obviously, if you're doing constipation, you're wanting the softer stools and the looser bowel movements at the beginning, so you can usually dose that right at bedtime. And then we move on to magnesium bisglycinate, and this is a very popular form. It's one of my favorite. It can also be termed glycinate. So it can be magnesium bisglycinate, magnesium glycinate. They're both identically the same. It's great bioavailability, very minimal laxative effects, again, because it is attached to that amino acid glycine. And it contains 2 glycine molecules for every 1 magnesium molecule. So you're likely not going to get as much magnesium in a standard bisglycinate because the glycine molecules are fairly big. But we do know that glycine is calming, it supports detoxification, it's great with cellular functions. And it's also, the nice thing about magnesium bisglycinate is that it doesn't require stomach acid for its absorption, because it passes into the cell via the amino acid transport. And so this means that those individuals with poor digestion or absorption can actually still get the benefits of magnesium even though they have absorption issues. So I often use it for those individuals as well. But like I said, it is a nice all-around form. And if you have patients that have multiple things, this is definitely one of the forms of magnesiums that I use. In clinical practice, chronic pain, anxiety, insomnia, stress reduction, and muscle relaxation are probably the big ones for magnesium bisglycinate. So then we move on to magnesium malate, and magnesium malate contains malic acid, which is also another amino acid. We know that malate plays a role in the energy cycle, so it has the ability to improve our ATP, which is our energy our energy currency in the body. So this form has been really studied extensively in fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue patients because it helps with relieving muscle pain, muscle tightness, and those trigger and tender points. Now, I also use this on athletes because malate has also been shown to improve exercise performance, muscle performance, and as well muscle tension. So it's a really great form to use with high-performing athletes or people who are doing long like marathons and like long periods of exercise. It's also well absorbed. It causes minimal digestive upset, if any, and usually does not result in any type of loose stool or anything like that. Then we have magnesium orotate. This is actually just starting to come onto the market more. It has more availability. It wasn't that easy to find a few years ago. It's starting to become a little easier. It's still not as obviously popular as citrate or bisglycinate. But orotate actually includes orotic acid, which is the natural substance that is involved in your body's construction of DNA. And so it's been studied specifically for heart health. And what they have found is that they are able to actually, the magnesium has been able to help the heart cells repair and improve their function. And so in clinical trials, they've improved heart failure with this, high blood pressure, angina, exercise performance, headaches, dizziness, those kinds of things. Again, this form of magnesium has good bioavailability, but I would say that this magnesium is very much directed towards heart health and heart issues, so especially the more severe heart issues. Then we have magnesium chloride, and chloride is mostly used in topical formulations, so in magnesium oils, magnesium sprays. We often find this in trace minerals, liquid format, so alongside other minerals, obviously. We see that chloride can improve blood pressure, metabolic profiles, very good for insulin as well. It reduces our inflammatory markers like CRP. And there's been lots of research on this in anxiety and depression where they saw scores actually improve in like 6 weeks of giving chloride. This form is again not bound to an amino acid and therefore can very easily cause loose stool if given too much at one time without some type of titration. Most times trace minerals, when they're mixed together, that's not an issue, but sometimes we can see it on the topicals, especially if somebody has irritable bowel syndrome or an inflammatory bowel disease. They usually get a little bit of loose stool with that when just too much comes in at once. But chloride also has been shown to have some research to help increase stomach acid. So that's going to help to improve magnesium absorption. So even just giving the trace minerals with the chloride can help to absorb some of that magnesium. And then we have magnesium threonate, and this is another one of my favorites because it's the only form that can cross the blood-brain barrier. And this is a relatively new form of magnesium. It's much more available now than it was a few years ago, but this form can actually increase the number of neurotransmitter sites, which means an improvement in short and long-term memory. So what they did was in 2016, they did a study on elderly patients with early stages of dementia and who had significant cognitive impairment. And they dosed them the 3 and 8 for 12 weeks. And at the end of 12 weeks, they were able to see a reverse of brain age by an average of 9 years. And so they showed significant improvement in cognitive function in just 12 weeks. It's also really great for brain health and mood disorders. I use this for anxiety. So because magnesium also interacts with the GABA receptor, it's very good for anxiety patients. So I use a lot of this with depression and anxiety. And then we have magnesium sulfate, and this is not used in formulations, but is better known as Epsom salt. And I thought I would include it here because it actually has tons of research and actually can make your patient feel that much better. So it's a compound of sulfate and magnesium, and we know that sulfate has been shown to strengthen the walls of our digestive tract and also has detoxification properties, so it can release toxins. And we know that if someone just has an Epsom salt bath, it relaxes the nervous system. It's great for muscle and joint pain. We don't know how much magnesium is actually going into the system through transdermal, so through the skin, but we do know that it does go in, and it can also vary from individual to individual. So someone may have more absorption of transdermal where another person might have less. But regardless, it is definitely still a great form of magnesium to use, especially for stress reduction. 2 cups of magnesium Epsom salt in some hot water and 20 to 30 minutes in the tub is usually what I recommend. So this is probably the second most common question that I get is, how much do we dose? And magnesium dosing is really difficult because, again, it's very individual. We need to look at the patient, and we need to look at what are all the factors that could be causing magnesium deficiency in the system for that patient. What are their symptoms? What are the signs that could possibly direct us there? And then we dose according to that. And of course, sometimes in the literature, it gives us dosing. So for instance, like I said earlier, there's 600 milligrams was dosed for migraines. That is 600 milligrams, but if you're depleting magnesium with several other things, you may need to dose more. The recommended dietary allowance of magnesium is between 310 and 400 milligrams per day. This is the minimum that is necessary. And from my experience, many individuals require more than that. There are some that require less, and they are usually the very sensitive patients. So we start very low, and they usually don't need as much. But it's always really important to get patients to consult with their practitioner before starting any supplement, especially something like magnesium, because obviously if you take too much, you can have a lot of GI stuff. If you don't take enough, you're not going to get the therapeutic value. And if you're taking it around medication, we have to be careful there as well, because it can interfere with some medications, especially thyroid medication, which is often very common in the population, especially women's health. So dosing really depends on the individual's health concerns and their lifestyle factors. But you do probably want to start around the 310 to 400 milligrams per day. So now we're just going to touch quickly on food sources. And I know I said that, there's a decrease in the amount of nutrients in the soil, but that still doesn't mean that we don't want to include foods that are rich in magnesium, and I always get patients to include them into their daily diet. And so we'll just go over those. So leafy greens, spinach, kale, collard greens, turnip greens, all of your greens are great, not just for magnesium, but also calcium and other nutrients. Pumpkin seeds are probably your best bang for your buck. A quarter cup of pumpkin seeds equals 317 milligrams of magnesium. So you can see that that's getting almost to the recommended dietary allowance amount. So definitely pumpkin seeds are going to bump up magnesium. Flax seeds, avocados, nuts, Brazil, and almonds are the highest for magnesium. And then we have dark chocolate. Who doesn't love dark chocolate? But here the thing is it has to be 80% or higher to get a good therapeutic amount of magnesium from that. Fatty fish, so sardines, salmon, those are also rich in magnesium. And then some grains for those that can handle them, and that's quinoa and buckwheat. So those are kind of the foods that I make sure that patients are including into their food, into their diet daily, because this type of magnesium coming from these foods is different than the supplement form. And so we can actually take advantage of that. And finally, we're going to talk about the top health benefits of magnesium. And we know that magnesium deficiency is linked to numerous health conditions, and we know that supplementing with magnesium has shown positive outcomes. And I could go over lots of health benefits of magnesium, but I have chosen the most researched and the most common ones that we would see in practice or that are coming into our offices on a daily basis. So the first one we're going to start with is inflammation and chronic pain. And we know that inflammation, especially chronic low-grade inflammation, is usually the root cause of most chronic diseases today. So it's definitely something that we want to look at and control as much as we can. And magnesium is often overlooked when it comes to anti-inflammatories in favor of, your fish oils and your turmeric and your boswellia, and that they're all great supplements as well, don't get me wrong, but I always throw in some magnesium because we know, and the research has shown, that it has a potent impact on reducing inflammation. And we see that in the research, especially with individuals who have a CRP, which is the marker of inflammation, higher than 3. So if you have patients that have CRPs of 6, 7, 8, 9, or even higher, we see magnesium supplementation really beneficial in bringing those CRP levels down. And then, of course, with low levels of magnesium, we see this activation of, or an increased activation of white blood cells and the increased production of inflammatory cytokines, which are TNF alpha and IL-6, as well as free radicals. And so magnesium deficiency actually indirectly enhances oxidative damage of the molecules by inducing a stress response. And then when that happens, our body stimulates this catecholamine release from the adrenal glands. And those catecholamines, so that would be like cortisol or adrenaline, they increase the production of these reactive oxygen species, and those are free radicals. And so this is how we see this inflammation start to happen. Now, we know pain is largely promoted by inflammation, and so dealing with inflammation can also help us deal with pain. And we also know that tight, tender muscles, trigger points, irritated nerve endings, these are all sending pain signals to the brain. And here's where magnesium plays that key role in regulating and relaxing the muscle and the nerve and improving nerve function. So it does the opposing effect of calcium in that it releases and it relaxes those muscle and nerve functions. So great supplement for helping with inflammation and chronic pain. Insulin resistance. This is almost another little, not little actually, epidemic in itself, with people being insulin resistant, whether they have diabetes or not. I see many people that come in that have insulin resistance, just haven't been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So it's definitely something that is commonly seen. But we also see that magnesium is deficient in those type 2 diabetics. And that is because they increase the loss through the urine, and then they also have low dietary intake. So we have to remember that high levels of insulin are going to deplete magnesium because it's going to be excreted out by the kidneys. And so if you have high insulin levels, you are going to lose more magnesium. And so these people, they could be supplementing or they could be taking in magnesium, but they're losing it as fast as they're bringing it in. And so that is an issue. We also see that it also is in low magnesium levels shows impaired insulin action, which then leads to insulin resistance, which then eventually leads to inflammation. So it's a vicious little circle that kind of keeps happening. But we do see from the research that magnesium has this special relationship with insulin, and it's that the receptors depend on magnesium for them to function and properly respond to insulin. So when we see the magnesium deficiency, those receptors are not working efficiently. And so in a study, actually there's quite a few studies that show taking a magnesium supplement for more than 4 months significantly improved insulin resistance. And this was in people with and without diabetes. So it doesn't matter if they're not a diabetic, it still gave significant improvement. And so we have to look at appropriate magnesium levels when we want to prevent metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is, I don't know about you, but I see this all the time in my practice. All right, so this is just a diagram that I wanted to show, and we can see that here's the low dietary magnesium intake. It's got impaired absorption, drugs, right? Medication, alcohol, genetic factors, maybe impaired renal function. These are all leading to this magnesium deficiency. But then we see what this magnesium deficiency is. So we talked about how it causes that low-grade inflammation. So increased oxidative stress, increased cytokines, increased circulating CRP. Right. And so from there, we can go back and forth, and it can also cause obesity, right? Because we know inflammation is the underlying root cause of a lot of these things. And then we see that going down to metabolic syndrome. And a magnesium deficiency over here shows the impaired insulin signaling because there's decreased intracellular magnesium, which can lead to type 2 diabetes or go back down to metabolic syndrome and type 2. So we see this as a complete cycle that happens over and over again unless we cut one of these issues. So we need to be dealing with this, and we need to make sure that magnesium is sufficient in our patients to stop this cycle. Okay, so it improves bone health and activates vitamin D, and this is really important as well. Remember, we said 50 to 60% of the magnesium is stored in the bones, and we need vitamin D as a component in bone health. And we also know that magnesium is necessary to convert vitamin D into its active form so that it can actually turn on calcium absorption. So we need adequate amounts of magnesium to absorb, metabolize, and distribute calcium. Now, where the problem comes in is when you take large amounts of vitamin D3, which is the active form of vitamin D, it does not activate in our body unless it goes through the liver by this enzyme here that needs magnesium. So a lot of people think, oh, just because I'm taking vitamin D3, it's active, it's going to be fine. I'm going to be able to activate this and I won't need to worry. There's a problem here. This enzyme requires magnesium. And so what happens is we obviously know vitamin D deficiency is large in the population as well. And we tend to tell people to take vitamin D, let's get you up to an optimal amount. But when you're taking these large amounts, and you don't have enough magnesium in the system, like I said earlier, you can induce a magnesium deficiency or you can actually make it worse. But what you're also doing is you're intensifying the calcium. So the calcium is not getting absorbed because the magnesium isn't there to do that. And so what happens is, well, let me just back up a little bit. Magnesium's key role is in making sure that it prevents the accumulation of calcium in the cells, arteries, and joints, kind of like K2. And so when we don't have enough magnesium and you're taking all this vitamin D, you've got a lot of extra calcium happening, and that's starting to deposit into the kidneys and can result in kidney stones. It'll deposit in the joints and do calcifications, and as well as in the arteries. And so it's important that we make sure that if they're vitamin D deficient, they're likely vitamin or magnesium deficient. This is how we need to be thinking. We also know that when calcium is elevated in the blood, it's going to stimulate calcitonin. And in turn, that's going to turn off the secretion of the parathyroid hormone. And we know that both of these hormones regulate the levels of calcium in our bones and soft tissues. And both of these are related to osteoporosis and osteoarthritis. So there's something that we don't want. We don't want calcium elevated in the blood. And this is happening when we're bringing in too much vitamin D without the presence of enough magnesium. You can also use K2 to suppress some of that vitamin D, as they do have vitamin D3 and K2 together now for that very reason, but we still need magnesium in order to activate the vitamin D in the body. So they are a marriage made in heaven. Think of them like that. And of course, we see magnesium has been shown to slow the rate of bone turnover as well. And then we know that it improves sleep and reduces stress because of GABA levels. So it's going to help with calming the mood, improving sleep. It's going to help with restless leg syndrome. It's going to suppress cortisol and, of course, reduce oxidative damage. And then we also see that it downgrades the stress response because it is not producing as much cortisol. This is where magnesium has most of its study. This is what most people know magnesium does. So I'm sure that you'll be able to read that and go through that. But we know also magnesium improves hormones. So we see that we need it in the production of thyroid hormone. It helps us to convert from T4 to T3. It helps make our steroid hormones, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. So that's going to be very helpful when we're dealing with menopause, migraines, PMS, anything hormone related. We know magnesium promotes sleep, and that is very crucial for hormone production because we see DHEA and growth hormone happening in good deep sleep and going through the sleep stages. And then we know that it also helps with our mood boosting hormone, serotonin, and then serotonin makes melatonin, which is then going to help with sleep. And one of the other important factors of magnesium is that it supports healthy estrogen clearance. So it supports the COMP enzyme in the liver. Without magnesium, that doesn't work properly. So it helps get rid of some of those metabolites, the hormone metabolites, estrogen metabolites, and thereby reduces the risk of estrogen excess conditions. We also know magnesium is really good in cardiovascular health. So low levels of magnesium show higher incidence of heart disease. It's very good at inflammation, vascular hardening, and very good at decreasing high blood pressure. So we see in the research and in patients that with magnesium supplementation, we can decrease systolic blood pressure by 3 to 4 millimeters of mercury on the systolic end, and diastolic by 2 to 3 millimeters of mercury. And so we also show that it improves blood vessel stiffness, which is obviously key for proper blood flow when it comes to cardiovascular function. And then finally, it improves digestive health and function. And we talked a lot about this already when we were going through the different forms, but we need magnesium for just the natural mechanics of digestion. So stomach acid, repairing and protecting our organs, the digestive organs, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and we need it to make digestive enzymes so we can digest our food. It keeps our pancreas healthy. We also need it for bowel movements to expel wastes and toxins. And so we talked about magnesium citrate relieving constipation. And then I also talked to you about how it helps with acid reflux. So it just allows the lower esophageal sphincter to remain closed, because if we have enough magnesium in the system, the food isn't going to have that delayed emptying in the stomach. And that is what causes that pressure to raise the lower esophageal sphincter. And so we talked about that when we did the citrate. And so that is the end of the presentation. So I want to thank you so much for being here and taking the time to learn all about this amazing mineral. We know that there is so much research with magnesium. There's over 12,000 publications on the PubMed database. So we know the efficacy and the safety and the therapeutic value of magnesium is big. And there is more than enough proof that supplementation with magnesium is necessary to improve a number of health conditions. And as Laura said earlier, this webinar was sponsored by Biogenna, and Biogenna commits itself to health and science, and their aim is to share knowledge with you all so that you can establish a basis for healthy lifestyles. And then I did put the references in here for you to review, and we can do questions.
Thank you, Dr. Woger. We have time for a few questions. Just a reminder, you can enter your questions into the chat box. Our first question that we have is, since magnesium is so deficient in the population, would you recommend prescribing several different forms for a patient?
Depending upon, yeah, that's a good question. So I usually look at what the symptoms that the patient is experiencing and what their health conditions are. And if I have, let's say, I have a patient that has fibromyalgia and they have difficulty sleeping, and then they have difficulty going to have bowel movements because we've got to do some gut health, then I will use a formulated magnesium supplement that might have malate in it, some bisglycinate, and then some citrate, kind of to cover all the bases. But I sometimes will also do just one form of magnesium just to see if it improves one of the symptoms, because a lot of the times there's crossover between all the different forms.
Thank you. Let's see here. Question here is, what are the non-invasive methods to test for magnesium deficiency?
The non-invasive ones, I guess you could, well, blood would be one, and then there is hair analysis, but that its accuracy is not where it should be. It's really hard to test non-invasively what your magnesium is. And it's just because it's not accurate and it's where it's distributed, and we just can't get to those areas with things like a blood test, or like the hair mineral analysis will take your hair and kind of look at it. But again, it's still only one component of where it is. Like, for instance, I'll give an example. If somebody has osteoporosis, we can definitely say that that person has a magnesium deficiency. And we like to right away blame calcium, but we know that most of the magnesium is in the bone. And so that is something. So we kind of really always got to look at the health condition and the health symptoms.
Thank you. What is the best timing for magnesium supplementation?
Yeah, that's a common question. Great question. So there is really no specific time, except for if you want to take it for sleep. Obviously, you're going to take it 30 minutes before bed. But what I have found in practice, and what's actually often used in the research when they do this on individuals, is equal spacing. So if you're taking, I don't know, 400 milligrams of magnesium in a day, you want to space that out. So you want to maybe have it like morning, afternoon, and then in the evening, or at least morning and in the evening. And we know that magnesium actually, if you can handle it on an empty stomach, has better absorption because stomach acid is higher when your stomach is empty. So we know that there's more absorption when taken on an empty stomach.
Thank you. And our final question is magnesium safe for children?
Yes. So magnesium is safe it's actually one of the safest minerals. The only indication, and I'll just mention this on the adult side, is if someone has a kidney disorder or a kidney issue, we have to be careful with how much we're dosing, only because that's how magnesium is excreted. But for children, it is safe. Usually the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, is somewhere between 80 and 150 milligrams per day, but you can also do a formula where it's 6 milligrams per kilogram of weight. And and we know that some kids, especially kids that have ADHD, they are almost always magnesium deficient. And in their case, it does show up on their blood work. So that's a really good time to, make sure to supplement in that condition.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Woger, for a great webinar today. I do have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we officially close out. Many of you have asked about the on-demand materials. So just as a reminder, everyone will receive a thank you email within the next 2 business days. This will include a link to today's live webinar as a recording, so you can play back as needed, as well as a PDF of the presentation today. So again, look for that email in the next 2 business days. Also, if you could please fill out the short evaluation form that will appear once the webinar closes. We would love to get your insights on today's webinar. I want to thank Dr. Woger again for a great webinar and taking the time to create this presentation for us. And I want to thank all of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. Again, this webinar was brought to you by Integrative Practitioner and sponsored by Biogenna. Thank you all.